Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a question that affects millions of us. Is there actually a link between getting a tattoo and getting cancer? We're going to follow the clues, from the ink that goes under your skin all the way to your body's immune system, to really piece together what science knows and what it doesn't.
Okay, so let's jump right in. For the longest time, everyone just kind of assumed that tattoo ink stays put, right there, in the skin. But the real story here starts when scientists realized, whoa, that's not true at all. The ink travels. So the big question became, where on earth does it end up?
To follow that ink's trail, we first need to talk about your lymph nodes. Now you can think of these as the security checkpoints of your body. When you get a tattoo, your immune system sees thousands of tiny puncture wounds filled with a foreign substance, the ink, and these little checkpoints immediately spring into action.
And this right here brings us to our very first clue. When researchers had the chance to examine deceased individuals who had tattoos, they found something pretty startling. The ink hadn't just been broken down or flushed out by the body over time. Nope, it had actually migrated to the lymph nodes and just stayed there, accumulating for years, right up until death.
But here's the thing, it wasn't just harmless pigment. When they looked closer, researchers found a whole cocktail of other chemicals mixed in with the ink. We're talking about things called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs for short, and even heavy metals. And some of these substances are actually flagged by global health organizations as things that could potentially cause cancer in humans.
And that quote really gets to the heart of the whole mystery. We know these chemicals can end up in our lymph nodes, but as researcher Christopher Clemenson asks, once they get there, do they actually cause any harm? That's the million-dollar question.
All right, let's move on to the next phase of this investigation, trying to connect the dots in actual human populations. And this is where the story gets really complicated, because the search for evidence, well, it's led to some seriously confusing and contradictory reports. So some of the very first big studies seem to find a connection. For example, there was one study looking at thousands of Danish twins, and it suggested that having tattoos larger than the palm of your hand was associated with a higher risk of both skin cancer and lymphoma, which is a cancer of the immune system.
But almost immediately, other scientists started raising some red flags. Dermatologist Nicholas Kluger, for instance, pointed out some pretty major flaws. He said, for one, they were lumping different types of skin cancer together, which you just don't do. And maybe most importantly, they often fail to account for sun exposure, which is by far the biggest risk factor for skin cancer out there.
And this is where the evidence just got totally messy. Get this, a study in Sweden found that tattoos increase the risk of melanoma. Okay. But then another study in Utah found the exact opposite, that having large tattoos might actually be protective. I mean, with results like that, the whole connection to skin cancer started looking very, very shaky. The link to lymphoma, however, that one seemed a little more solid, at least at first. A really influential study led by an epidemiologist named Crystal Nielsen made huge headlines when it found that just having a tattoo could raise a person's risk of developing lymphoma by about 20%. And that was even after they tried to account for other things like smoking.
But that 20% finding was challenged, and fast. Other experts jumped in and argued that if you look really closely at the data, the results weren't what they call statistically significant. Now, in plain English, that means the 20% increase could have just been due to random chance, not the tattoos. And that obviously cast some serious doubt on the whole conclusion. And Nielsen's study had another fascinating twist. It found that the size of the tattoo made zero difference to lymphoma risk. Now, this was so interesting because it totally challenged the common sense idea that the risk simply came from the amount of ink in your body. I mean, if a tiny little tattoo carried the same risk as a full back piece, something else had to be going on. The investigation really needed a new lead, a fresh angle, and it came from a place nobody expected. A research lab that wasn't even studying cancer. They were just trying to find a kinder way to tag their lab mice.
So, meet Santiago Gonzalez, an immunologist. And he just really hated the heavy metal clips they used to identify mice, mostly because they seemed to bother the little animals. So when someone on his team suggested tattooing as a gentler option for an upcoming vaccine study, he thought, yeah, let's give it a try.
And right away, he noticed something really strange. The tattooed mice had what he called super swollen lymph nodes, and they were just full of ink. It was a massive inflammatory reaction. This accidental discovery was so striking that his team basically put all their other work on hold just to figure out what was happening.
And what they found was a potential breakthrough. They discovered that the tattoos were creating the state of chronic, low-grade inflammation that was actually weakening the immune system's response, but only in that local area. And this led to a whole new theory. What if the risk wasn't from the chemicals in the ink itself, but from the body's constant low-level reaction to them? Because after all, chronic inflammation is widely known by scientists to be a condition that can help cancer develop.
So this new inflammation theory was a huge lead, right? It connected tattoos to a known cancer mechanism. But it also really highlighted why this case is so far from being closed, and why scientists need much, much better evidence before they can draw any firm conclusions.
See, up until now, pretty much every human study on this topic has been retrospective. That means they look backward in time, asking people who already have cancer about their past. It's fast, but it relies on memory, which can be super unreliable. The real gold standard is prospective studies, where you follow huge groups of people forward in time for years, even decades. They're slow and crazy expensive, but they're way more accurate. And the good news is, those kinds of studies are finally getting underway.
And these new, more detailed studies are already turning up some really important stuff. They're finding that, getting tattoos often goes hand in hand with other lifestyle factors, like smoking or drinking more, which are themselves known cancer risks. A lot of the past studies didn't properly account for these other factors, which could have totally skewed their results.
So, after following the ink into the lymph nodes, looking at the mice, and weighing all these conflicting clues, what's the verdict? What does this all actually mean for you if you have tattoos, or if you're thinking about getting one?
Well, the consensus among researchers, like epidemiologist Rachel McCarty, is really a balance of awareness and caution. There is a biological plausibility, basically a scientifically believable reason to think there could be a risk. But, and this is a big but, there is absolutely no definitive proof of harm yet. There is still so much that we just don't know.
But here's a fascinating and honestly a pretty counterintuitive takeaway that came up over and over again in the research. If you're now worried about your tattoo, should you go get it removed? And overwhelmingly, the experts say, no, don't do it. And the reason is kind of wild. Laser removal works by blasting the ink particles into much smaller pieces. But that breakdown process can actually create new substances that are potentially even more toxic. And these tiny new components can then travel even more easily throughout your body. As Rachel McCarty puts it, if the tattoo cancer theory is true, getting a tattoo removed could theoretically be one of the worst things that you could do.
So, the investigation continues, and while these new studies will hopefully give us some clearer answers in the future, for now, the case of the traveling ink leaves us all with a very personal question. In a world that's full of unknowns, how do we decide which risks are worth taking for the art we choose to live in? Thanks for joining this explainer.